have come. Is already those in tribute. We need to repent, turn from our way, and overcame. And if we're possibly lukewarm, then we repent, turn from our ways, and he overcame. And if we're possibly lukewarm, then we have been forewarned.
Oh Lord, we voices and hands in praise. Your love surrounds us, never fades. We worship you, our souls ablaze. Holy is your name. Forever we proclaim. Hallelujah, hallelujah, we sing to the King of all. Hallelujah, hallelujah, our hearts in awe. We find peace and grace. Your mercy covers us like a warm embrace. We offer our lives a living sacrifice. Our faith in you will never die. Your light shines bright, guiding us through the night. Hallelujah, hallelujah, we sing to the King of all. Hallelujah, hallelujah, our hearts in awe. Hearts in awe, our hearts in awe.
Yeah, and if there's goodness in our lives, it's because of Jesus. And if our bodies are a living sacrifice, it's an offering to Him alone. Oh, I have failed Him, and you have failed too. But He is perfect, spotless, and brighter than the sun. We may be scattered, we may be torn, but our God is one.
From the Big Bang Theory to the creationalist view of this planet, from the stars and moons and all the galaxies, to where did humanity get its origins? Who is Jesus? And is he really God? And who are the angels? Do demons really exist? And if so, what are they? Really? I'm James. And this is Kenner. And this is Double-Minded Conversations Down the Rabbit Hole. Well, hello there, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome back to Double-Minded Conversations Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm James.
I'm Kenner.
And I'm Jeremiah.
And let's see. I hope our voices are coming in clear. And yeah. How was y'all's week?
My week was pretty good. Just real super busy. We asked God to help out with the business and give us some work, and now I need like 12 days a week to be able to get caught up on everything. So yeah, it's good. How about you?
My week was full, just like probably everybody else's was.
Mm.
How was yours, James?
Full.
Yeah.
It was very full. Yeah. It was fun though. It was all right. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a fun weekend too so far.
Well, if you joined us last week, we discussed the Tower of Babel, and that was a pretty
Did
interesting.
you catch that one?
I didn't
You know,
see that.
Good.
That was very
I'll have to
interesting.
watch that.
Go back. I believe I put it in our podcast under Double-Minded, so go back and check it out if you hadn't seen it. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and share. Go ahead and hit that like button and share this live to get us out. So today's topic is going to be
The Dead Sea Scroll.
The Dead Sea Scrolls.
I just want to show this real quick.
Yeah.
James brought this to Jeremiah and I. This is it's a smaller replica.
Yeah, it's just a replica
of the book of the Isaiah scroll. And this is the only complete scroll that was found in the caves of Qumran in 1947 by some Bedouin shepherds. But it's really, really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is really cool. Thanks. I don't want to rip it.
I wish
Sorry.
I could.
Yeah, sorry for opening that.
Oh, yeah.
But before we get into what the Dead Sea Scrolls content was and the significance, both pro and con to that, I think it's important to know who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least who in some biblical scholars' minds wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls are nothing but a cache of scrolls that were found in Qumran in 47, and about 40% of the scrolls that were found were biblical. Then there were lots of other writings about daily life for Jewish people. And then there was also a group called the Essenes who had a bunch of their documents about how they do their day-to-day operations, the hierarchy structure, what their theology was, so to speak. And we're going to just get into today who the Essenes were. And there's going to be some pushback because we're definitely all not in agreement on who the Essenes actually are and what they did. But what the research that I will be giving you will be given to you straight from the Essenes themselves, from their scrolls, not someone's interpretation of them or by biblical scholars saying this is what they are, this is who they are. But the actual scroll itself has been translated by the same people who translated the Isaiah scroll from Qumran will be the people that I will be talking about today. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts before I get started into this little brief presentation I have about who the Essenes were?
Yeah. So how many scrolls are we talking about when we are saying the Dead Sea Scrolls?
The Dead Sea Scrolls, that's just what they call them because they were found by the Dead Sea. Right. In layman's terms, it was just a group of scrolls that were all found and thought to be written, but mostly written by the same people who lived in that area, and those people were named the Essenes. Now, it's not definitive. They don't have The only way to prove it is to go there and say, hey, did you write this? There's no way we can do that. But what we do have are textual critics, both atheists and non-atheists, right?
Mm-hmm.
That are comparing, like people like Wes Huff, right?
Okay.
Like
Yeah.
like they're textual critics, and what they do is they can take each scroll in the literary style of the time, and they can tell you when these are dated, and that is also reinforced by carbon dating, which is ironic, proving like because in some Christian mindsets and mine as well, carbon dating is like it's bad, but when carbon dating proves the validity of what a Christian is saying, then carbon dating is legitimate. But I personally
carbon
believe
dating is flawed regardless.
well, carbon dating is flawed because when you're talking about ancient times, there's no way that you can like carbon dating is flawed when you go past like 50,000 years, right? Like they're finding carbon in diamonds. How does that make sense?
Right.
I mean, diamonds take millions of years to produce. There should be no carbon in them at all, but yet they find carbon in them. So some would argue that that proves a young Earth, which it probably could. You know what I mean?
Right.
It definitely probably could. I do like what we touched on briefly about the Shroud of Turin is that new X-ray spectrometry that they do.
Oh, yeah.
You know, but the only way that could work is to have like an actual relic, you know, that to date it from.
Right.
You know, like you can't just find a rock and say, hey, this is this old, or hey, this is this old. But yeah, so there's some pushback on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's going to be because some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are our earliest copies of the Bible, right? The Hebrew Bible. Before that, we had the Septuagint. That's the oldest that we had. That goes back 1,000 years. And then around the 6th or 7th century, some Jews got together and came up with the Masoretic text. Now, what's interesting is a lot of the scrolls from the Dead Sea Scroll catalog actually have both. Like they coincide with the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. And there's a lot of debate going on about, oh, there's like 100,000 variants. That's ridiculous. Don't listen to those people. They're just trying to tell you that the scrolls aren't authentic. And we're talking about little letters because they didn't have vowels back then, you know, like little letters, you know, there's nothing dogmatically different from the book of Isaiah right here, from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the book that we have here. There are some words that are different.
Mm-hmm.
And some would argue that some of those words can totally change the context of the meaning. We can get into that once we open up the scrolls in the next show of this series. But we're thinking about what, maybe a 2-3 part?
I'm thinking, 3.
2 to 3.
2 to 3. 2 to 3.
Okay. And hopefully we can have Jeremiah here with us for that. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, just what you were talking about with the quantity of the scrolls
Mm-hmm.
is they don't have a definitive number.
Okay.
Right.
That because you see some have big numbers, some have small numbers. When
Right.
you look it up. So
Uh-huh.
unless you go talk
Right.
to somebody that's actually been there and dug them out, you
Right.
don't know for sure how many that
Exactly.
they have.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
That's true. And that's something that we got to get right too. So what the Dead Sea Scrolls and that cache of documents that was found, what they do have the only whole scroll is Isaiah,
Mm-hmm.
but they do have, now the word fragment means just that, fragment. I'm talking like little 1 inch by 1 inch pieces. They've got that all the way up to like 70% completed books and then everything in the middle, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they do know that they have like 14 copies of Enoch was found there. They have like, I don't know the exact numbers, but among the most copied in the Dead Sea Scrolls was Isaiah, Enoch, and the Psalms. Those were the most copied, the most copies they found. Now, how they came up with that number, I don't know. If I had to guess, I guess they just found a bunch of fragments and started translating them, and some of the fragments said the same exact thing. So they just said, well, then we'll just count this as another copy, right? So fragments of at least 14 copies of Enoch, and I think Isaiah was number 1. Isaiah had a bunch of copies, which back then in that time frame, not a lot of people could have scrolls. That's why people went to the temple to have the word read to them. And what biblical scholars, both Christian and secular alike, they actually say that the more copies of the book they had, the higher the regard for that document, right?
Yeah.
Like
'Cause
if,
you kind of
right.
didn't want to like.
right.
You
Why
know,
would you
like-
copy something that you didn't think was important?
Yeah, you always
Right.
wanted to make sure that you had a copy of it.
Exactly.
So what how many languages are we talking about? Like what languages?
There's
are
there's
these
several
scrolls
languages.
found in?
There's several languages. You have Aramaic, right? You have Hebrew, and you have Greek.
Okay.
You actually have Greek found at the Dead Sea Scrolls. You have, I believe, there's some Armenian too. Don't quote me on that, but whatever. There's some Armenian there too. So it's almost like a treasure trove of documents that I would call to be on par with like the Library of Alexandria, right? Like you've got a bunch of different things from a bunch of different sects, a bunch of different political views, a bunch of different biblical interpretation views.
It's funny that you say library, but we'll get into that.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and with the Essenes, they were a sect that was in the 3rd century BCE, and they disbanded 1 year after 1 AD. At least, I mean, some people claim there's Essenes today, and there probably are. I've seen that stuff myself. They're interesting, but what I will say is that through history, right, you only have documentation from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from Pliny, from Josephus, who named the Essenes and what they did. And one of the things that they did,
Philo as well.
Philo, right?
Yeah.
Philo was in there, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the things about the Essenes that I find interesting are the similarities that they had with John the Baptist and with Jesus and his teachings, right? Because some are attributing John the Baptist to actually be a member of the Essene movement, which I find it interesting because the Essenes, the best that we can tell, is that they disbanded 1 AD, right? They're from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century, so not AD. 1st century, what would you call that? You've got BCE is before Christ's existence, and then not after death, but what's the other one? Like what would be the
CE.
like, CE? Okay,
Yeah.
so CE. That's it.
Yeah.
So it branches from. I've got AD here, and that's not right. I'm glad you said that. It's from 2 BC to 1 CE, and that's just the only documents that they have from Qumran. Now there could have been other sects that branched out, and maybe some of the Essenes left. But let me tell you a little bit about the Essenes from the community rule of the Essenes. Now, what the community rule of the Essenes is a document that was actually found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's how some of the people are saying that it's possible that the Essenes wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? It's possible that they did because the writing styles are the same. It's from the same time period. And I know that some people say that some of the documents were taken from the temple to the Essenes to save them because of the temple's destruction. That could be, but there's conflicting stories about how the Essenes were completely against the temple, completely against their teachings, completely against the Sadducees and Pharisees, and didn't even consider them priests at all. They have their own set of their belief system and their belief hierarchy structure, and we'll get into some of that here. Do you guys have anything to add before I go through these? They're just brief. These will be quick. These are just some facts about the Essenes. There's no like dogmatism or. I'm just going to go over some of these, but stop me if you guys.
Jeremiah, what do you know about the Essenes?
I am just on the cusp of picking up information about them because
Yeah, me too.
Talking to Tanner on it. So my understanding of them is that they would have been more of like the reclusive part of Judaism. That would have been more that they would have been more like, we're going to get off by ourselves. The version that we see of, society is pulling away from what we think it should be.
Yeah,
so we're going to go try to find our own way that, and maybe some of them did go out in the wilderness and others lived in little communes. And you see that, continuing here today, that there's versions of different religions that pull away. And I mean, even among the Islams, you have a mystical Islam, the Sunnis.
Yeah.
So
right.
it's that group, they have influence over the group, They have influence over the group because they're kind of outside of it and looking at it, and they're analyzing it versus the people that are on the inside.
Yeah.
So they're doing more. They're backing away a little bit and saying, "Are we doing things the way that we should be doing them?" And so you've got that as part of it. But so you've got that as the good side. The other side that you can fall into the trap of is if you pull away too much, then you're not really connected to what's going on in the day to day. You kind of make your own up, and I think that that's probably part of what happened too with them, is that there's just this, they have their own group.
Yeah.
Right.
And kind of like monks, right?
Yeah, exactly
Kind of
like
similar.
monks.
Similar
I
in
actually
that
wrote
way.
that down right here.
Yeah. Like
I actually wrote that down right here. Yeah.
I've been reading some too, and I just that's the picture that I get in my head is like modern day monks.
Exactly.
Right.
Like
Exactly.
in a monastery. So
Yeah,
Right.
Something similar to that. So people would have looked at them differently, because they're on the outside.
Kind of like the
that.
disciples.
Well,
You know what I
probably
mean?
somewhat like that.
Yeah.
But I think that I guess I'd kind of like to look at a lot of different versions of what they say of the Essenes, but I guess kind of what I'm picking up is that they have the connections that they had back when have somewhat trickled down today.
Connections to what?
Just the connections that they had to society and
Right,
the way
yes.
that they influenced it.
Yes.
Okay.
Others kind of have carried that down.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah, I agree.
almost like the powers behind the scenes sometimes even.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
The way I interpret the Essenes is that if you look at if you look at their everyday life, their day-to-day life, right, and what they practiced and what they did and how they didn't want to change any of Moses' law, about how they lived in strict accordance to that. They lived apart from the world.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, that's what Jesus preached, right? We are not of this world.
But he didn't say leave the world. He would have said, I need you in the world. You're not of the world. You're in the world, but you're not of the world.
Right.
So there's a difference between that, and I think that that's something that's easily missed. And what I mean is that I cannot influence society if I leave it.
Right.
I can't be the light if
That's
I
a
take
good
the
point.
light with me and go.
Right. But
I have
what light would they have had? Because we're looking at this thing in retrospect. We know that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And these
Right.
guys existed 2 BCE.
Right. I'm saying with what you had said about Jesus is saying that we're not of the world. True, we're not of the world, but we are in the world, and He was the light of the world, and He calls us the light of the world. And they were not the light of the world, but since He is, that's where the difference is. And I think that pulling away and starting our own group and living in a commune, and that kind of stuff, or just living in the desert and saying, I'm going to get to God this way.
Kind of like John the Baptist did.
Well, partly, yeah. But the thing that was different about John the Baptist is John the Baptist came back.
Came back to what?
Came back to society.
After Jesus started his ministry, yeah.
So he
right.
came back
Right.
before Jesus started his ministry.
Well, he
because
baptized
he was the one
Jesus
that
in
baptized
the wilderness.
So
Right.
yeah,
And then he
So-
came back. That's when he
So-
went to Aaron and got killed.
yeah. But what I'm saying is that John and Jesus both spent time in the wilderness, similar to the Essenes, but the difference was the purpose behind that time in the
Sure.
wilderness was not to run away and hide. It was to go out and do business with God and then come back ready to do what
Right.
the
Right.
calling
I
was.
agree with that wholeheartedly. That's absolutely with my research. That's,
Yeah.
I would
Correct me if I'm wrong, because what I'm seeing is like, you have Jesus and you have John the Baptist that went out. Yes, they went out into the wilderness like the Essenes, but the Essenes, I'm gathering, were in like small communities.
Somewhere,
some were. Yeah.
Were they
right.
ever like by themselves?
Yes.
Yeah.
That too. You had some that
You had both.
some that were married and
Some-
some that stayed single and lived
Okay.
out by themselves.
That's right.
Okay.
And how they replenished their numbers is some people did get married, and then they would take in orphans, right? They would take in orphans and raise them up in the Essene traditions, right?
Okay.
But the one cool thing that another similarity that I like is how they could not stand the Pharisees and Sadducees. They were at odds against them. And it wasn't so much that they left to go start their own thing. They moved outside of the jurisdiction of the high priest, so their arm couldn't come out and touch them. That's why people came to them for the truth, or what they considered the truth, because they were outside the jurisdiction of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That's why they moved there.
So that's interesting, because what I heard was that the Essenes, some of them also would have had power, and they would have been part of the same structure as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but they, like you said, didn't like them.
Right.
They were in the group.
Yeah.
They were like the Pharisees and the Sadducees considered them part of the group, but they didn't agree with them at all.
Well, some did.
They were at a lot of odds with each other, because they believed,
right, most
you guys are too much in the world.
Right.
We need to pull out.
Exactly. So what I'm gathering from the Essenes is that they both had representatives in the Pharisees and from the Sadducees. Like, they had people that would come out to the wilderness to listen to them, and they agreed with them and brought that stuff to the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin shut them down. Just like they tried to shut Jesus down. Like, anything that goes against what we say or our authority, we want nothing to do with it. So they had some friends in the hierarchy in town. They did. People actually came from Jerusalem to get baptized by them, which is another correlation where Sadducees and Pharisees came out to see John the Baptist as well. When he said, "You brood of vipers, who warned you of the coming wrath?" You know what I mean? So it's really interesting. But let me go over some of these.
Yeah,
what's
like
that?
That's a good point.
Yeah. So some of the stuff here, this is just basic facts. There's no dogmatism or doctrine in here. But who the Essenes were, they were a Jewish sect. Oh, what's up, Jay Everett? I just saw you on there. How you doing, buddy? Good to see you here. Jay's one of our guys who comes to every show and gives us feedback. So it's great to see him here. They were a Jewish sect between the second century BC and first century CE. I guess that's how we would say that. They were allowed marriage in some cases, but most of the men were celibate, kind of like monks, like you guys were talking about. Mm-hmm. They were at odds with the Pharisees and Sadducees. They didn't think that the high priest was legit. The Essenes believed in spiritual practice, study of scripture, and manual labor. They were huge on manual labor. Fundamental practices was love God and your neighbor as yourself. And I'm pulling this stuff from the community rule of the Essenes, which is a document they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So people are just saying,
love God and who?
What's that?
Love God and who?
Love God and your neighbor as yourself.
Okay, your neighbor
yeah.
as yourself.
Like basically love everyone. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Basically just treat everyone great. And they were huge on prophecy, which is probably why they like Enoch so much and Isaiah so much. And then Jeremiah. They love Jeremiah too. Their fundamental practices, okay, we went over that. They baptized for sin and living a pure life. And then I wrote monks right here.
Oh, okay.
Because that's kind of like how the monks did it.
Yeah.
They lived apart from the world. They had a strong belief in justice and that God would overcome evil. They were apocalyptic and waiting for the Messiah. They believed that the souls continue after death. However, they did not believe in the resurrected body, which I find very interesting.
Say that again. How did that go?
It says they believed in the soul's continuance after death.
Right.
However, they don't believe in the resurrected body. Now, I want to stop here to say something, and I want you guys' feedback on this, because that to me sounds like they're kind of taken from the Sadducees and from the Pharisees with some of their doctrine. Right? Because isn't that a big split that the Sadducees and Pharisees had?
Yeah. The Sadducees would believe nothing happens after
right.
And the Pharisees would believe that there is going to be a resurrection.
Right. So they're kind of double dipping, right? Or maybe just taking the truth.
On the fence. Yeah.
Or just taking the truth, right? Because not all of the Pharisees said was wrong, and not all the Sadducees said was wrong. But they missed on some key issues. But I find that interesting. They were very invested in prophecy. They were waiting for the end of the age, the coming Messiah. They believed that the coming Messiah would lead a new era and that he would purify the temple, right? So it's possible that some of the documents from the temple wound up there, but in their own mission statement, it says that he's coming to purify the temple. They had a strong battle They had strong beliefs in the battle of good and evil at the end times, which is why they were huge on Daniel and they were huge on prophecy. They were apocalyptic to the core, like just waiting for the end of time. You know what I mean? Just whatever the prophet said. Their interpretation of it is actually, I think, where a lot of us land today. Like they had that part right, which is why they were the only ones, I believe, and many others believe, doesn't mean that it's true, but they were so big on apocalyptic scripture and study that they actually got it right. They were waiting for the Messiah to come and were waiting for him. Why the Pharisees and Sadducees reading the same scrolls just overlooked it and didn't understand that they couldn't comprehend it.
How many copies of like those other prophetic books?
I don't know
Like
the exact
Daniel
number.
and-
There's several.
Okay.
Yeah, there's not full copies,
Right.
not complete copies.
Right.
But like I said before, when they say there's 14 copies of Enoch, that doesn't mean there's 14 full copies.
Full
That
copies,
just
there's
means
fragments and
right.
stuff like that. Yeah.
Well, fragments that say the same thing,
Right.
which leads them to believe that this is part of this copy and this is part of that copy. That's why they say there's two copies. If you've got Daniel 7 written down twice and you only have a fragment, what's that tell you? There's two copies of Daniel 7 that was there at one point, and these two survived, right?
Yeah.
So, and then they were waiting on a blessed kingdom to the faithful, right? Good was going to overcome at the end times, and a blessed kingdom to the faithful. The word Essene actually means modest, humble, and pious ones. They had 12 leaders, one high leader, and an inner circle of 3 priests. And what the Dead Sea Scrolls does is it actually pushes back our oldest copies by 1,000 years, because the oldest copy we have of the Old Testament is the Septuagint, right? And then the Masoretic text came I think 700 years after that, actually, when the Jewish leaders got together and said, we're not going to listen to these Greeks because they believed the Septuagint was flawed. The Jewish leaders did. That's why they got together and came up with the Masoretic text, which was translated from Hebrews by Hebrews, even though they spoke a completely different dialect, right? So, but anyways, that's what I have on the Essenes. And like I said, I'd love to get into some awesome conversation. I think there are some similarities between the way the Essenes lived and the way John lived, and the way that they were apocalyptic and waiting for the Messiah to come, just like all the Jews were.
Right.
But that waiting got diluted by the Sadducees and Pharisees, right? By making it all about them and taking it away from the actual scripture. And the Essenes, I think they were making too much noise, and they would have, caused an uprising. I mean, because you have to understand, this is exactly during the time of the Maccabees.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
This is during the Maccabean revolt. You know what I mean? So once all that was done, now you've got Rome saying, look, if there's any more problems, we're just going to obliterate all of you guys. And to me, I believe that's why they left as well, to get outside the reach of both Rome and both outside of the Sadducees.
80-70?
80-70 was what?
80-70.
That wasn't the Maccabees.
Well, I'm talking about like when the Essenes are out.
When they were out.
When they were done?
When they would have had to leave, right?
Right.
Destruction of the temple, 80-70, they're out.
Out of what?
They had to leave the region.
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. The Essenes predate the destruction of the temple by 300
No,
years.
I'm talking about when they're gone, though.
Right, and that's an awesome point you make, because that's an interesting conversation. Why is it that right after you start having the first Gospels published about Jesus being the Messiah, about him being here, the Essenes disband, and you have no more writings from them after that. Now you've got people popping up saying, "I'm an Essene because I follow their rules." That doesn't make you an Essene.
Where'd they come from in the first place?
They were a group of regular Jews who didn't believe. They were basically like John the Baptist and like Jesus, the way they thought about the hierarchy of the Sadducees and Pharisees.
Right.
They couldn't stand them. They thought they were wrong. They defiled the temple, so they left. And they were waiting for the Messiah to come and repurify the temple, which is Enochian talk, and it's a little bit of Daniel 7 talk. But I find it interesting that they were real big on the book of Enoch. Enoch 1. When I say book of Enoch in the Dead Sea Scroll context, we're specifically talking about Enoch 1. All the other ones were made way after the fact.
So did they form like out of like rebellion to the the Sadducees and the Pharisees?
From all the research that I've came up with, and I've seen pro and cons to both sides, but a lot of guys generally agree that they just wanted to get away from these people because they believed the Messiah was coming soon. And they came out, and that was their whole life. They were waiting for the Messiah. You know what I mean? That was their whole life. They was big on manual labor. They was big on being good to one another. They repent for the remissions of sins. They didn't take the Sadducees and Pharisees as being authoritative. So it's just, but what was you talking about, Jeremiah? AD 70? What was the significance of that?
So that's when the Essenes would have had to have moved out, because that's when the temple would have been destroyed. Rome and all that, like everything would have went down.
Right.
So
why would they have moved out? What do you mean moved out? When you say moved out, you mean moved out of
because
Jerusalem?
they would have been persecuted. They would have been pushed out.
They were being pushed out. They were being pushed out in 2 BC. They were being their group in Qumran, the ruins they have, and they actually found, James Tabriz, an archaeologist, actually found one of their latrines, an ancient latrine that dates back to the 2nd century BC. So they were already out there before Jesus was even born.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is though that they would have been off the scene though in that area by AD 70. Right around there. They would have left. They would have had to have left because
left Qumran?
Yeah, left because from the information that I've been studying, it says that they actually moved towards like Spain after that.
Yeah, there's no proof. There's no
left
proof
that way, but
there's no proof of
but
that.
before that, it seems that there's different sources that are pointing to the fact that they had something to do with an extra. They had an extra level of interest in angels versus the other groups.
Probably,
and I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, probably. I know what you're referring to. I don't want to badmouth this guy on air. You know what I mean? But people can do their own research.
Not just one guy. This is multiple.
Well, I mean, but what I'm saying is the information from the community rule says that they disbanded the 1st century. So if any other sects branched off from that could have been, right? It's possible, but there's no proof of that. The only proof that we have are the words written by the Essenes called the community rule. Everything else is just conjecture. And like when Josephus writes about him, when Pliny writes about him, when Philo writes about him.
I would say that the Essenes continued after this time, but they moved.
No, they didn't. Because they believed that Jesus was the Messiah. They disbanded at 1 CE. They disbanded. And maybe it was.
You think that because I thought that what you'd said that they were still waiting for a Messiah after Jesus.
Well, look, they were waiting for Jesus before Jesus was even born, right? Like they were waiting for him. They were out in the wilderness 2 BC, right? Meaning 2nd century, 200 years before Jesus was there.
Okay.
You know, so they're an apocalyptic sect is what they're actually labeled as, and they're waiting for the Messiah to come.
So would they still have been considered waiting for a Messiah after him?
There's the only proof. That's an interesting question you have, because that leads me into this next line. That's interesting because I want your thoughts on this. My thoughts on what you just said was that John the Baptist would have been a ranking member of the Essenes, right? And when Jesus came and he said, "Behold the Lamb of God," right? And then he baptized them. And then 2 of John's disciples left the wilderness and became Jesus' disciples. I find that interesting. Now, is it a smoking gun that says there's a correlation between the two? No, of course not. But if you look at the evidence, you can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater when you're looking at what the Essenes did, how they lived, how John lived, right? And then Jesus' gospel he's preaching is the same thing these guys are believing in. And all Jesus is preaching is what? Old Testament prophecy, right? I am this guy. I am the one you've been waiting on.
Right. So
I think they believed him. That's why they disbanded, because they believed he was the Messiah.
So what about the group that continued on that didn't believe him?
I don't. There's no proof of that group continuing on after him. The only proof that they have is that there's some people that pop up that still to this day claim to be Essenes. I mean, that's not a smoking gun.
What do you know? Like what group? What are you talking about?
I'm just saying that, like, anything that would be considered a group, even, I don't know, information that I saw leads to it coming down through the ranks of, like what I said, of the powers that go on behind the scenes.
Do you want to cite
in
that guy's
churches.
name so people can look up this guy?
Yeah, if you want to.
Yeah.
What's
That-
his name?
His name is Gary Wayne.
That
Very
guy would be
good.
one.
Mhm.
That guy would be one of them.
Okay.
He's got an interesting take.
He believes that he believes the secret societies are started from the descendants of giants and Nephilim. That's what he believes.
No, he doesn't believe that. He says that they believe that.
Who believed that?
The secret societies started from.
In other
Nephilim?
words, that they would be. He does say something along those lines, but he's
Mhm.
talking about the fact that fallen angels would push their will upon humans, and that the angels themselves wouldn't be doing the work, but that they
Oh,
would
right,
push
they had
the
a mediator,
humans-
Oh,
right.
they would
yeah,
push
yeah,
the humans
100%.
to do the work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In other words, that
Yeah.
that the way that they influence humanity is, that to take advantage of people and to direct them to do their will, but not say, oh, this is my will,
Mhm.
for you to follow this way, and to,
'Cause they were
to do
afraid
this
of God.
because-
Yeah.
well, yeah, like the idea is that, yeah, definitely
They
being
were afraid of God, right?
but it's an interesting take because it goes clear back to Babylon and Babel
And Nimrod. Yeah,
Mhm.
right.
and all that, to where
Yeah, that's what we just
it's
talked
like-
about.
Yeah, we
You
talked
need to
about that
relax.
last-
You get
yeah.
Babel. We just talked
okay,
about that.
well, the interesting thing about it all is that it seems that the Gnosticism
Mhm.
is the multiplicity of gods, but it's these angelic beings that,
Mhm.
that
Little G's.
little
Yeah.
G
Right,
gods,
yes,
little
correct.
G gods that are worshipped,
Mm-hmm.
and
Because God allowed it.
whether they're worshipped in the outright sense, or they're worshipped because you're doing what they want.
Mm-hmm.
But it's this fulfilling Satan's desire of, and that's something interesting that I wanted to talk about too.
Sure.
Fulfilling Satan's desire of bringing about a one world order
Mhm.
and a one world government,
Mhm.
and some type of an antichrist,
Yeah.
to where the humanity destroys themselves before God can save them.
So you're saying they're
So-
trying to force God's hand
Well,
with
no,
the Antichrist and the end
to
time.
not force God's hand, but to push God's hand.
Or that's what
out.
I mean. Take his
Yeah,
place.
To
Yeah,
take his
yeah,
place
yeah.
to where God's will
Right.
cannot be completed because they've already destroyed
Yeah.
humanity themselves.
Yeah.
Like, to get humanity to destroy themselves. That's the interesting thing. And that same guy that we were talking about there, Mr. Wayne, he brought something up that was pretty interesting about the just the history of, like, the kings of England and Europe and all that, and how they claimed their rights of authority.
Mhm.
And later on, how you get the King James Version, because you have all these different groups of Christianity that are fighting with each other and
Mhm.
destroying the kingdom, in a sense.
Mhm.
And he's
Yeah.
like, so he's got to make a political move, and he's
Mhm.
like, we need to unite these people somehow. How can we
Kind
do
of
it?
like what Constantine did.
So yeah, exactly.
Right.
So
Exactly.
so to unite the groups, he has this Bible translated into English,
Mhm.
and the people that he has do it are the guys that are his upper class people that know how to write.
Mm-hmm.
But those guys that know how to write are guys that are part of secret society.
Right. They're defiled.
And
right.
these are the secret society guys that are writing, and you've got some weird things that go on in that version. And, like, one of them is the word Lucifer, like we
Mhm.
talked about.
Mhm.
Lucifer is not in the Hebrew.
Mhm.
It's a
Right.
Latin name.
Mhm.
Right.
And that
From the Vulgate.
name,
That would come from the Vulgate.
Halal. Halal is the Hebrew, right?
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. But the Latin name, I wrote it down. It was Lucifere or something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
And it means son of the morning.
That's right.
So, and strangely enough, you've got he was suggesting that the Freemasons take that as that's their authority figure.
That's part of it. That's what King Solomon and Hiram is their earthly connection to the Luciferian.
So it's that secret knowledge that can only be given supernaturally or divinely or whatever you want to call it, but it's not straight from God. It's from an angelic source. Right. So that's the thing that I was talking about with the angels, and whether it be the good Essenes that that went the right way, but I think that you see it with everybody, because in Jesus's day, you've got some of the Pharisees that started following Jesus, and others that totally went away. And I don't see much about the Sadducees, but
which Pharisees followed Jesus? Which Pharisees would have followed Jesus? Like, where's the proof of that? What documentation is that? The only Pharisee that
Paul would have been one.
Yeah, but sure. Paul cast away that. So, and then Nicodemus could have been another.
Nicodemus, interestingly enough, from the source, Mr. Wayne, he was suggesting that that down the road, like he's bringing in Knights of Templar and different things like that, that they would have taken what the Essenes believed and ran with it, of the not necessarily the getting away, but they did that. They did live similarly to that to begin with.
Who did?
They took vows of poverty and chastity, and
the Essenes?
No, the Knights of Templar.
Oh yeah. Right,
so they followed in those ways of, like, the Essenes would have been about purity laws, and they would have been about, the body needs to be, sacred, and it needs to be, taken care of, and you need to focus on the body.
Right.
And strangely enough, though, that body that they didn't even believe got resurrected. But so it's weird. But
I think that all of the first century Jews got the resurrection wrong. Like, everybody was expecting a different Messiah. Everybody would, because Jesus' resurrection is not the same as the resurrection that the Jews have been waiting on. So I think it's important to separate those two.
The Jews would have thought the same thing as, like, what Job would say, is that at the end of the days, there's going to be a resurrection.
End of the age.
Yeah, the end of the age, the end of days, when time is done, when it's the very last day, when God said, that's it, it's curtains. There isn't going to be any more days on earth.
And some would say that already happened.
That's to them. Well, we're still having days.
Yeah, right. Well, but see, again, just like we was waiting for a Messiah to come in with a sword and liberate everyone. Like, I mean, Jesus' own words was, some of you will not taste death until all of these things happen. You know what I mean? So obviously there's something going on there to where it's not true, or it's either one or two things. It's either not true, the prophecy didn't happen when he said it was going to happen, or number two, it happened in a way that we really can't comprehend.
Or it happened and it's going to happen.
Right. Or like a precursor to what's coming.
Right. It happened at one level, like the transfiguration.
Exactly.
That's the version of glory, the little bit of the pulling back of the curtain saying, look, this is who I am. Right. You can't see it anymore, but you're going to see it for sure when I come back again. But that
I find that interesting, because, like, right after he says that is the transfiguration, right?
After he says what?
Right.
About
right after
not tasting death until
you see this, until you see these things fulfilled. Yeah.
And then, like, right after
that's interesting. You're talking about the two disciples that went up with him.
Yeah.
What do you think the significance of Elisha and Moses going up there with Jesus was? I know we're getting off topic on the
They did not really. I mean, they died, but they didn't die in a sense, because nobody saw them die. But there you have again in Jude that you have them fighting over the body of Moses.
Right.
So he must have quote unquote left his body somewhere,
Right?
Because they're fighting over the body,
Right. Well, it says he was
But-
buried, died, and buried.
right?
Jesus,
But
or Moses.
yeah,
Moses.
but
But
there's-
Moses wasn't up there. That's kind of what I'm talking
but the
about.
significance, though, I know what you're talking about up on the mountain.
So what are
So-
we talking about? Moses?
Moses would have been the guy who would have had the law given to him.
Right. No, I know who he was.
So-
I'm saying what's the
right.
significance from the transfiguration?
Right. That's why it's significant. It's because he's the representation of everything of the law. Okay. So the law is fulfilled in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Moses represents that law
Mm-hmm.
because he's the lawgiver.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one that God said you will be
Mhm.
like God to them.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting because
So-
there's a lot of other striking similarities between Jesus and Moses as well.
Yeah.
And we get into some of that, like out of Egypt I called my son, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and he's actually called a Mashiach. Moses is in the Hebrew. All it means is anointed one, right? That's
So,
all.
and he
that's
would
all
have
it
been.
means.
He would have been.
That's what I'm
anointed.
saying. So is
Yes.
David,
Yeah.
right? So, but then it gets fuzzy when you talk about the kings when
Yeah.
they got anointed. Is that the same type of messianic anointment, or would it have been a separate deal?
Well, you have.
Because Moses was God's anointed one.
Yeah, but you have through David's line.
Mhm.
Through David's line, David had a promise that he was given,
Mhm.
and the promise that he was given is that you will always have somebody on the throne.
Only if they follow his laws.
Yeah, but even when
When Solomon fell out, yeah,
was like,
and Rehoboam
Right.
took over. Yeah,
he said, still, because of your father, I'm
Right.
still not taking the whole kingdom away from you.
Just part.
Taking a lot of it away from your
he
son.
got
and giving it to
10%.
somebody
He
else.
got what? 10% of the kingdom is all David got. His line got.
They didn't get much. Yeah, it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was like 2.
Yeah.
But the backing up a little bit though, that you were talking about Moses
Mhm.
on the mountain. Then you
Mhm.
talk about Elijah. The thing about Elijah that you see is this: he had this relationship with God to where there were individual miracles that he did.
Who are you talking
No,
about?
Elijah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the miracles that Elijah did that passed on to Elisha.
Right. A
But it
portion
started-
of what
Yeah.
he had.
Well,
passed over.
he wanted a
a double
of
portion.
it.
Yeah, right.
But what Elijah did was in a way similar to Moses, but Moses didn't ever heal anybody.
You wouldn't call the bronze serpent an act of healing?
He didn't do the healing though.
I see what you're saying. But God used him to make the bronze
He
serpent,
did,
and
yeah.
that healed people.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. But there was similarity there, but there was something different about Elijah because there was a dead person,
Mhm.
the son of the widow
Yeah. Right.
that was risen,
hmm
and Jesus did similar things to that.
That's Elijah or
different-
Elisha? You're talking-
The
first one.
Elijah.
The
is
first one.
one.
Yeah,
Elijah,
right. Yeah,
not
okay.
Elisha.
Right, okay.
Elijah.
Okay.
So you've got different ways that he was a foreshadowing of the
Mhm.
Messiah, just like Moses was.
Absolutely.
But Jesus put it all together because he took all of the law, which
Mhm.
you could say Jesus was the law,
Mhm.
like when you see
In the Chosen.
in the Chosen, he's like,
Yeah.
guess what, guys? I am the law.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
So he takes all that embodiment of all the best of all the prophets
Mhm.
and all the best of all of those that gave the law, and he embodied that in himself.
Mhm.
So all those were foreshadows of him.
Mhm.
And those little bits of glory, like Moses had a little bit of glory
Mhm.
when he met with God, that
On the mountain.
that
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
like would leave
Yeah.
after he left.
Mhm.
And Jesus was like, it didn't leave me. I have to
Mhm.
hide it from you
Right.
guys.
Right.
I have to hide it from you
Mhm.
guys, or else you wouldn't be able to take it. So there's this.
So you're saying that Moses was the law, and
Moses represents the law. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Elijah the,
the
prophet,
lawgiver.
and Elijah the prophets.
Yeah, definitely the prophets and the power of God. I
Mhm.
mean, Moses was used with God's power too. I mean, you wouldn't have had the 10 plagues You wouldn't have had the parting of the Red Sea.
Mhm.
You wouldn't have had the bronze serpent that was
Hang
that
on.
healed.
If I may, what you just said, and with what you're saying, I just had an epiphany here. And correct me if I'm wrong, or if you guys think along the same lines. And if anybody has any questions, they can ask as well. So when you just said earlier that right before the transfiguration, Jesus was talking to the people and said, "Some of you will not see death until you see this fulfilled."
Right.
And then right after this, I got goosebumps thinking about this. What you guys said.
And
right after that,
was the transfiguration.
you've got the prophets being represented.
Mhm.
Right.
You've got the law being represented,
Right.
and you've got the fulfillment of the law in Jesus, even
Right.
though it wasn't fulfilled.
All there.
All of that
Ooh,
right
is-
there.
That's going to be.
Yeah, see, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That's really good.
That's kind of
yeah.
where I was.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
figured that's where you were
like-
going. And
yeah.
then listening to both of you, I was like,
So
Yeah.
you've got
That's
everything
interesting.
from the past,
Mhm.
and then the future's here,
Right,
and then the future's even yet to come.
right.
So that's
Right.
what I'm saying. It was partially fulfilled.
In a
there,
sense,
and
it was a foreshadowing.
Right.
Right. Okay.
right, and the
Sure.
glory that they had up there.
Mhm.
Peter didn't know what to do with it. I mean,
He wanted to build a tabernacle and worship Moses and worship Elijah.
yeah, he was like, hey guys, it's good up here. Let's.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
almost like you feel like you're in the 70s, and he's like drugged on something. He's like, whoa, look at the music. I mean, look at all those lights.
So we're getting a little bit shorter on time, but what you're talking about, we're going to back up a little bit. First of all, guys, if you're new to the channel, we may have a topic that we talk about, but this show is rightly a show called by James The Rabbit Hole. We start off in one spot and go everywhere, kind of like our Bible studies.
Right.
But an interesting point you make, all of the things that you're saying about Babel and Nimrod and lesser gods, we just, dude, I wish you were here for that. Because we went over the Tower of Babel and Dr. Michael Heiser's viewpoint on that. He's dead now, rest his soul. But God disinherited humanity at Babel and gave them over to worship the host of heaven, which is what in Acts 7:24, that's what he's referring to.
Right.
And so these lesser gods was given dominion, and God let them get the worship.
Mhm.
So, and that's an interesting take that he has on the secret societies, is how they could be derived from those type of offspring. That's very, very interesting.
I wouldn't necessarily say derived from it, but that's where they would get their
Supernatural
motivation.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
In other words, the desire is for godhood.
Right.
That's the
Right.
desire. The desire is, I want to be a god.
Mm-hmm.
And the angel, whatever you want to say, fallen angel,
Mhm.
whatever you call it, that influence says, okay, it's going to cost you something, but I'll give it to you.
Now, if you go to Psalm 82, right?
Yeah.
God sits in the divine council
Right.
and casts judgment on the gods because they were judging men unfairly. So that kind of plays along with what you're saying about how, yes, these new lower G gods are given, like the Prince of Persia, for instance, or whoever was given dominion over certain sects of people, right? Because we have, at the Tower of Babel, we have the disbursement of all humankind with different languages, and which we were talking about how that's how the flood story could have easily spread to all the lands, because Babel was just a little bit after the flood, you know what I mean? So it's still fresh on everyone's mind. And then the interesting thing is that some of those gods were ruling unjustly and they were doing wrong. So God judged them for that.
So that could be an interpretation of it, but if you have a flood
Mm-hmm.
that even was covered the whole earth,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
and then everybody that's left that hadn't died is all in one ship,
Mm-hmm.
they're all going to be in one location
Mm-hmm.
when they land,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to have to go out from there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And as they're going out from there, I mean, there was still the mandate to repopulate the earth,
Right.
and to leave, to leave and go and fill the earth again. But nobody was willing to do that. So you have this Tower of Babel that and it wasn't called the Tower of Babel.
It was Babylon.
It was just a tower.
It's a ziggurat. Babel means Babylon.
The Babel means confusion.
Confusion.
It means
Confusion,
confusion
right.
because that came later, the confusion that happened.
Mhm.
So, but when you had that tower that was being built, that was like a one big city. We are not going to do what God wants.
Right.
We're going to do what we want.
Right.
We're not going anywhere.
Mhm.
We're gonna do our own thing. We're gonna build our cities.
And
we're
that
gonna
made
make
God
our
mad.
power.
Mhm.
And God's like, this is not going to work
Mhm.
because I'm going to have to do the same thing to them again that I just did to them. I'm going to have to take them all out again, and then there won't be anybody.
So what do you think the wording he says right after that? I believe it's Genesis, what? Let's see, it's Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9, something like that. We were talking about it last time. The wording when God got upset at them, he's talking to his heavenly host and said, look what humankind.
That's clear back in Genesis.
He said, look what mankind is doing with their same speech, and they're all together.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't go down and stop them, there's nothing they're not going to be able to do.
Yeah.
God was upset about that.
Let me go back. Genesis 9, verse 1. Then God blessed Noah and his son, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth.
Mhm.
So they're given a mandate.
Mhm.
It doesn't take long after you've got verse or chapter 11. So you've got the table of the nations of their sons, and then it says in Genesis 11, verse 1, that
Yeah,
the
11.
whole world had one language and a common speech.
Yeah, listen to what God said about it. Go ahead.
As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, let's come make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens. That's exactly the opposite of what God did.
Yeah.
It's just the opposite.
Right.
And then it says, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth.
And what did
So-
God say after that?
So God gave him a command.
I'll read it.
And then I've got it next here.
Okay.
God gave them a command, but then right after that, they were like, we don't want to do that.
Mhm.
We want to do what we want to do.
Right.
We want to do what we want to do.
Exactly.
Then the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them.
Mhm.
Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other.
So why do you think God would have a problem with humans? Because that's similar language in the Garden of Eden, when he said, now they're eating from the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. Now they're going to be like us. And so, like, why do you think God has such a problem with humans advancing themselves? And I say that to lead into a segue to technology.
So why would you answer that? How would you answer that question?
I don't know. I think I don't know. I'm on the fence either way. First, you do have the mandate where he says, don't do this. Right? Because if you do this, it's going to lead to a life of sin and corruption.
Okay.
Same way, if they didn't follow his mandate, then I would interpret that as, if you guys do this, you're going to open yourselves up to a bad life. And that's exactly what it would have done.
So
I think
go ahead.
What I would say is it's because they weren't thinking about what God said and what even God wanted. They were thinking about themselves.
Mhm.
They were thinking about their own happiness.
Mhm.
Like in the garden,
Right.
know, the reason why he had a problem with it is because they thought for themselves. They thought
So God doesn't want us to think.
themselves. They thought of themselves. That's what I'm trying to say. They thought of themselves, and just like the people at the tower, they thought of themselves.
Okay.
So
Yeah, we've had a visitor all this time.
Yeah.
if you think about that's a good question to
Yeah.
ask. So I would say that the reason why God didn't want them to do that, to just make a one big city and
Mhm.
leave the whole earth behind,
Mhm.
he didn't make the earth for us to make one little
Right.
city.
That's how I would see it. Right.
He's like, I got all this land for you.
Right.
I got all this territory for you to claim.
Mhm.
And that's the same thing that he has to do to the
Mhm.
church.
Sure.
It's the same thing he
Sure.
has to do to us because we want to stay safe.
He did it to the temple.
Yeah,
He did it to the Pharisees and Sadducees.
Well, he did it. He even allowed it to happen right after, the persecution of Stephen.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
So because everybody was scared and wanted to stay there, and Jesus and the Spirit is like, the only way for you guys to get out of here is for me to allow persecution to come upon you. So Satan, come on in. I'm going to use this for good.
Interesting.
So that's the way that God has to do it sometimes.
Yeah,
because if we won't obey him, he'll let that happen to us. So we'll obey him. And
it's not that he's trying to dictate anything. He just sees the end game. He sees where these decisions we're making now are going to affect us down the road, and he's trying to help us.
Right. And so,
but the people in the city, they weren't the whole of mankind, right?
Not in the city.
Like after the flood, they had already
just the descendants of Cush. Just Nimrod.
Yeah.
So just the descendants.
That wasn't the whole of humanity.
That wasn't all of humanity at Babel. No.
So here's what this says again. It says, now the whole world had one language and a common speech. And it says, as people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. So it doesn't say where anybody else went.
Right.
It just kind of says like everybody went east.
Well,
it doesn't say anybody else moved anywhere else.
Doesn't the line, when it talks about the lines, tell you where everybody went?
Well, afterwards that people left.
Right. Well, I mean, like the descendants of Cush and Canaan and Ham, like it tells you where they went, but that doesn't come till I think it's 12.
Yeah, it doesn't come like
I think it's after Babel, right after Babel.
So
yeah, it is before.
So
it is before. Yeah. So they went to different locations. I think just the curse line of what was his name?
So you got Cush.
Ham.
Cush was Genesis 10:8 says Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, and that's why it was said like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad.
So that's his kingdom.
Calneh, and Shinar.
And that's his kingdom. So
yeah, from there he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Reboth, Calah, and Rezin, and in between Nineveh and Calah, which is a great city. So, but it doesn't say. It says this later that the people spread out. Like Genesis 10:5 says that from these the maritime people spread out into their territories. But I think that and it says each with their own language. So before then, I don't think anybody left. I think that everybody fell into that trap of like, you know what?
So it's almost like 11 and 10 need to switch spots.
Well, this is telling you what's coming, and then it backs up a little bit and says, this is what happened, and this is why
they okay.
So, but they did eventually spread out, but they spread out with their languages. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had a reason to leave.
Right.
The reason to leave, I mean, because they would have been 3 brothers and their wives and their kids. So they were all family. They're like, why don't we as a family stick together?
Which is what they did when they found Noah drunk. They were all living together.
So yeah. But so over time, they're like, hey, let's just be one big family. But in that, they were corrupting, because you got this corruption that goes on that says, we're going to work our way up to this God. We're going to work our way up to him.
We're going to try to bring God to us on our terms.
Yeah.
Instead of God having his temple where he comes into us.
And man's goal is godhood.
Which is what Lucifer's goal was.
Yeah. But our goal when we're born, a toddler thinks they're God.
Right.
For some strange reason, a toddler thinks, to an adult, they will say, I don't need to listen to you.
Right.
You need to listen to me.
Right.
I am the boss.
Because they don't know. Yeah. So when we go pick a switch off the tree to save them from what's down the road is why you have Babel. Hey, it was great to have all of you here. Jeremiah, it was awesome to have you here. James, you want to close us out?
Yes. Thank you all for showing up. Make sure you share this stream. Make sure you like this stream. Tell everyone about it. And join us next time. Thank you.
God bless.
God bless.
See you guys.
All right. Good show, guys. That was awesome. Very good.